Hello and welcome to part 15.5 of my video series on how to use Blender 2.6. This is actually an update to part 15 of my video series, which is part 2 of the physics simulation mini-series in Blender 2.6. The reason why I'm having to update this video from part 15 to part 15.5, which is this video, is because as of Blender 2.61 or Blender 2.62, what I taught in part 15 no longer works. So I'm redoing that video. This is the new version of the second part of my physics mini-series. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I'll put the link up on the screen right now, so you can go there, check out that video, watch it, follow along, and then come back to this video. That's pretty important to do. If you are in this video, there's two reasons why. You could either be somebody who has only just finished part 1, and if you are that person, welcome. Or you could be watching this video because you have already seen the old part 2 and you're coming back to update because what I taught is not working in your new version of Blender. So as of Blender 2.61 or 2.62, things a little bit changed in the game engine. They did some updates to it along the way. Of course, that's going to happen as Blender is a very frequently updated program. And those changes are normally good, but in our case they made things a little bit more complicated. There's only a couple of extra steps, so I'll highlight those extra steps if you're somebody who's already finished the old version of this video. Okay, so as of the last video, part 1, we created a scene with dominoes. I'm just going to quickly review what we've done. We created a scene of dominoes, and of course we've switched from the Blender render engine to the Blender game engine. And of course that changed what is in especially the physics tab of the properties window. We've made all of these dominoes into rigid body objects, which means that they are affected by gravity. And we've checked collision bounds under the collision bounds section, and we've changed the collision bounds type from cube to convex hull. And you could have a margin of 0.000 or 0.015. I kind of like 0.015. It tends to work out for me a little bit better than 0. And so if we press the P button with our mouse in the 3D view window, the simulation will run. Now I also have a finger that I've made. I think in the old version I've had to redo this file. I just had a cube. I kind of just modeled my cube to look a little bit more like a finger. Other than that, it's exactly the same. And we animated that finger pushing into the dominoes. And of course the dominoes don't fall over because we haven't animated those falling over and we haven't simulated them yet. What our end goal here is to accomplish is for the dominoes to be simulated, and then we want to record that animation to keyframes. Now we want to use the simulation, the game engine, to simulate that data for us. But of course it won't record to keyframes unless we tell Blender to record the simulation to keyframes. When we made this animation on the finger, it has 4 keyframes, and we actually made what's called an action. An action is just another word for an animation. But actions are a little bit better because, or they're actually a lot better because we can store them, we can name them, and we can refer to them in the logic of our game. I made a second window here, and I'm going to change it to a dope sheet. And I'm going to change the type of the dope sheet window. It's kind of a subtype from, actually I've already got it there. By default it'll be just called the dope sheet. I'm going to go to my action editor. This is where I can actually look at different actions that I have and apply different actions I have stored to the object that I have selected. So we made an action called pushy cube, and that's what the 4 keyframes are that we are looking at. Now the thing is, when we're recording stuff with or we're recording animation with the Blender game engine, we don't want to have this animation loaded up onto this object. We actually want to clear out the animation, which doesn't mean delete the animation, but we don't want it to be currently active on the object or any of the objects in our scene, because we're going to be recording a new animation essentially from the simulation. So we're not going to delete these keyframes, but we are going to unlink this action called pushy cube from the finger. If you watched the original part 2, part 15 of my entire Blender series, you'll know that I made a new action, and I don't remember what I called it actually, but that actually wasn't necessary. All I really need to do is unlink this pushy cube action from the finger. So what I'm going to do is I can press X, and what this X is actually not delete. It actually just means unlink data block. So it's unlinking the animation from the finger. Before we do that though, it's important that you press this F. This F stands for fake, I believe. And what this F does is it makes sure that the pushy cube action, or whatever you press, whatever action that you press this F for, is saved even when Blender closes. Now Blender is kind of neat in that, or I'll say neat in that if you have information in your Blender file that isn't being used and you save and close the file, Blender actually kind of just trashes that information sometimes. Sometimes you'll find that with materials that you make, colors. If you have made of like 100 colors and you're only using one of them, it will probably delete those extra 99 materials that you make because you're not using those materials anywhere in your Blender file. Same thing with actions, same thing with animations. If you're not using the data block called pushy cube, it won't save. So you press this F, just to kind of ignore that 2, and it will be saved in Blender even if you're not using it. So you can press F and then press the X, and it'll make it'll clear that action from the finger. You can always add it back. You can always click on this little icon with 3 little dots and press pushy cube, and that will add it back. But we're going to clear it off, and that's that. Okay, so if this were Blender 2.60, I would be all set. And I want to now, or I could record the animation. I'm going to go up to Game, and under the Game menu, there is an option called Record Animation. And this is how you actually record whatever happens in the game engine to keyframes. And so as of Blender 2.60, if I click that and press P, all would be wonderful. All would work. I could press P, and the Blender game engine would simulate, and the dominoes would fall over, and I'd just have to wait for it to finish. And I could press Escape, and I would just have to kind of move my playhead on my timeline, and we would see animation. So we can actually scrub through, and the animation is happening, and that's great. But there's one problem now, and that problem is, and I kind of stalled there when I noticed it again, is that the simulation did not record on the finger. And so the kind of animation happens. Now our timeline isn't long enough, so I'm going to go and turn that up to maybe 550 so that we can see the entire thing as it progresses. But the finger does not actually get pushed in. And if I have the finger selected, you'll notice that no keyframes are in the dope sheet. No new action was created for that finger, so there's nothing loaded right now. But if I go to any of the dominoes, you'll notice that new actions got created. In fact, for every one of the dominoes, if I go to this list, you'll see all these new actions because every time that you make an animation, it creates a new action. So when the Blender simulation happened and we had record animation turned on, Blender created new actions for each one of these dominoes. But it didn't do that for the finger, and that's because the physics type on the finger is static, and static is what we wanted because we don't want to simulate that finger. We don't want that finger to be affected by gravity or be affected by other objects that hit it. So it was great. It was working with Blender 2.60, but now it's not. So what we have to do, in fact, I'm going to back up several steps. I don't want the simulation to be there anymore. So if you're watching this and you haven't done what I did yet, just don't simulate until we've solved this problem with the static object. So I just undid a few steps, or hopefully I can. There we go. Okay, so going back, I'm going to have to redo just deleting or not deleting, but clearing that data, clearing the pushy cube action from the finger, so that now the finger has no action applied to it. Okay, so as of Blender 2.60, this would work as it is now, but it does not work now. What we have to do is actually change the type of physics simulation on the finger from static to dynamic. Not rigid body like the dominoes, but dynamic. And now we have a new problem, and that is that the finger is actually affected by gravity. So I'm going to, just to save myself a little bit of time, okay, record animation is turned off. I was going to turn it off. If I press P, the finger, if my computer can handle it, it will be affected by gravity and it will fall down if all goes well with my simulation. My computer just kind of stalled, but turning an object to dynamic physics type will cause gravity to be affected on it. But of course, we don't want gravity to be applied to this finger. The problem is that when we go to game, record animation, the only two types of physics where the record animation will actually work is dynamic and rigid body. So we have to choose one of those, as far as I know. So we're going to choose dynamic, which is the less susceptible to being hit by other objects. So what we have to do now is, because we have changed the type from static to dynamic, is select a collision type. So we're going to select collision bounds, just like the dominoes, and change it to convex hull. And I'm going to leave it at 0.0. And so now the simulation will run, and it should be okay, except that the object, the finger, will be affected by gravity. And so we're going to use the logic editor to quite simply stop gravity from being affected on the finger. If you've taken a physics class, physics in grade 11 or grade 10 or grade 12, you'll know that gravity affects objects at 9.8 meters per second square. So every second, an object will move down 9.8 meters, but of course it speeds up at a rate of 9.8 meters per second squared. We can actually see this and change this in Blender. If we go to the World tab, you will see under the Physics section, gravity is set to 9.8. Isn't that funny? That's Earth's gravity. We can change this. We can even make negative gravity, but we don't want to because we want the dominoes to act like they're on planet Earth. So we're going to leave that as it is, but we're going to set up a little bit of logic to stop gravity from happening just on the finger. I'm going to add a new sensor. Maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see. Onto the finger. We already have the always and action. So we have already said play the animation in the game editor. I'm going to create a new sensor. So I'm going to go add sensor, always, same as last time. Add controller, and same as last time. But now the actuator is going to be a motion actuator. So we're going to connect these. And the motion that we're going to make happen on this finger is the opposite of gravity. So gravity pushes at 9.8 meters per second squared, or 9.8 Blender units squared per second. So we're going to do the exact opposite. Now we have on this finger, the physics type is dynamic. If you don't have it set to dynamic, if you still have it on static, this section will be smaller. So of course you have to be on dynamic. And we're going to change the force, not the location, not the torque, or not the linear velocity, but the force on the z-axis, which is this column, to 9.8. Right now, the gravity is pushing it at negative 9.8, so we were going to cancel that out by pressing 9.8. Under the third column, which is z, there we go, we can see it now, or z, if you're American, on the up and down axis. So we've connected those up, and let's see what happens. I'm going to make sure my record animation is not turned on yet, because I'm just going to see what happens. And let's see what goes on. I'll press P, and everything looks good. The real test to see if this works is if we can record the simulation to keyframes. So I'm going to actually before we do that, I'm going to press P. I think we still have one more issue to deal with. Okay. I actually left the settings as I had them to work. What you will need to do is, by default, under the Physics tab, if you have your finger selected, the damping amount is set to 0 and 0 for translation, which is movement and rotation. So when you, by default, set your finger to dynamic type, the damping will be at 0 and 0. Damping just means slowing down of movement. So if you press P, what will happen is that your finger will start to kind of drift and maybe rotate off into space because it's a dynamic object and we've got basically no gravity. And once the animation kind of stops, the centrifugal force of what just happened continues the finger moving off into space. We don't want that, so we're going to turn up the damping in both the translation, the movement, and the rotation. So now, as I had before, once your animation happens and stops, the finger will stay in the same spot. So all of this good. We're going to go up to Game and Record Animation. We have no action currently on the finger, and we're set to record animation. So I'm going to save this actually, and I'm going to press P, and good things should happen. Our simulation should happen. It's recording it to keyframes. I'm just going to wait a second for all of the dominoes to fall over. I can't really see what's going on. So I'm going to press escape. Better thing to do, what I should have done just then is kind of zoomed out to see the entire thing. But let's check it out. I'm going to scrub through. To see the recorded keyframes, you might have to scrub through your timeline a little bit. So that looks really good. Everything looked or turned out. And because we added the second bit of logic, we added this kind of anti-gravity setup in here, we now have recorded keyframes on the finger. And of course that was because not only we made this new logic brick with the gravity, but we also turned it to dynamic, and we turned up translation and rotation. So the last part of this video is how to get keyframes that actually look good and how to make the speed of your animation work well. This is the same as my original video, so if you are coming back to this video after having seen the old version that doesn't work anymore, you can kind of cut yourself off, or this will be a refresher for you. When we record animation from the game simulator or the game engine, it records much slower than we want. If I play this back, which I am right now, everything happens really slowly. Another kind of funky thing about the simulator is that when you record, I gotta set the end of my timeline to 550 approximately. Actually, I'll do to 600. There we go, so we can actually see all those keyframes. When it records from the Blender game engine, it's going to record where the objects are on every single frame. So if I go back to my dope sheet, we don't really need the logic editor anymore. In fact, I'm going to go and get rid of that. It makes a lot of keyframes. It makes, for every single frame, it makes a keyframe. And that's really kind of ridiculous. So we're going to solve that now. Ideally, if you were animating all of this happening, if you spend a long time to animate this, you wouldn't animate every single frame. You'd only animate the key positions or the keyframes that you would need. And there is a cool add-on in Blender that you can use to solve this problem, and it's called Simplified Curves. So to add this add-on, you actually have to go into Preferences because it's not turned on by default. So I'll go to File, User Preferences, and under the Add-ons tab, we're going to go to the Add Curve section, and there are add-ons that aren't currently turned on or aren't enabled. And one of them is called Simplified Curves, right there. So I'm going to check that, and if you want information about it or how to use it, basically how to use it or where to find the option in Blender, is you kind of expand this out, and it says the location of it is, there is no location. You have to search for it. Search Simplified Curves. So I'm going to close this. We've enabled it. So now, with the finger selected, we have like this enormous amount of frames, almost about 575 frames. We're going to simplify those frames down by pressing the spacebar with the finger selected and searching for a Simplify Curves, and it will highlight up, and I'll press Enter. And to make this add-on work, to simplify this animation to very few keyframes, even though it'll be the exact same movement, is down here. As soon as you search for and press Enter Simplified Curves, this little section will come up on the side of your 3D view window in your tool shelf. Of course, you can press T to get that up. You can turn up the amount of simplification, and that will be, you should actually use your arrows, and the first little increment will be 0.03, and then 0.06, etc. And you'll also see that your keyframes have really been simplified up. You'll see now that if I scrub through, the animation looks exactly the same, except all the keyframes from about 155 all the way to the very last keyframe got erased because they weren't needed. The finger was still during that time. I'm actually going to go back down to 0.03, so we have a few more keyframes. Actually, you know what? I am going to stick to 0.06, and because that seems to work out really well with all the dominoes. So we're going to have to go through each one of these dominoes and simplify the curves. So I'm going to press spacebar, then press Enter because it knows what I searched for last time. I'll press reset and then turn it back up to 0.03. Go to the next one, spacebar, and press enter because it knows what we just searched for. Reset 0.03. So I'm going to pause the video now, and I'll come back when I've finished doing all these dominoes. Okay, so I've gone through and I've simplified the curves, in other words, simplified the animation of all the dominoes. If we go through, we'll see on each domino the amount of keyframes has drastically simplified, and that really helps us out. If you want to go and change any of the animation of any of these dominoes, of course having a keyframe for every single frame of animation, 24 frames per second, would be absolutely ridiculous, of course. So simplifying the curves really helps you out. The last step of this is going to be fixing the speed of the animation, because if we press play or Alt-A, which plays, the play button, the shortcut is Alt-A, it goes really, really slowly. So how do we fix this? Well, we're going to actually go back to our dope sheet, and this is where we can scale animation. Our dope sheet right now is set to the action editor, so we're going to go back to the dope sheet. With the action editor, you can only see one action essentially at a time, but with the dope sheet, you can see every object's animation and every keyframe in your entire scene all at the same time. And this is great. It can be a little bit daunting too. So you can select everything, or actually you don't have to select everything, it'll just show up. There is a little icon, it's a little mouse arrow, and if you click it, it'll only show the keyframes in the dope sheet of the object that you have currently selected. And that is very helpful, especially if you have a lot of animation, a lot of objects in any scene. But we don't really want to do that because we're scaling up the entire, or scaling down the entire animation. So I'm going to uncheck that, and I'm going to press A with my mouse in the dope sheet, and we're at frame number 0, that's what we want. And I'm going to press A again to select all the keyframes. And of course, if we press S, we're going to scale down the animation. So I'm going to scale it down, and the original length of this animation was about 575 frames. I'm going to scale it down to be about half of that, maybe about 250 or so. I'm just kind of eyeballing it. And of course, we can now, after I've scaled it down, we can press play and see what that looks like. That looks pretty good. If you're happy with it, we can go ahead and render or add materials or do whatever we want. Of course, we can go ahead and scale it down even more if we want this to go really fast. It is important to have your playhead on frame 0 because we want to scale down towards that playhead. That's how it scales down. If you have your playhead out here and you press S, things weird are going to happen. So make sure your playhead is at frame 0. And let's just go ahead and make this ridiculously fast and see what that looks like. And that's a really fast domino scene. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope you could follow along, give it a try. Of course, things like this that have lots of different steps will take probably several times for you to get right. So make sure that you come back to this video if you have any questions. Take another look, go through the video, pause it when needed. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.